The grand ballroom of the Blackthorn estate held over 300 guests that evening. Senators, executives, old money, in tailored suits and pearls. Graham Cole stood in the center of it all in his janitor's uniform, a mop handle still calloused into his palm, surrounded by people who looked through him like glass. Eleanor Blackthorn lifted her champagne glass slowly, let the room settle into silence, and spoke loud enough for every person in that hall to hear.
A single dad could never provide for my daughter.
Soft laughter moved through the crowd like a current. Graham did not argue. He did not move. He only closed his hand into a fist at his side and said nothing at all. Graham Cole arrived in Savannah on a Tuesday in late October when the air still carried heat, but the light had already begun to thin. He drove a truck that was clean but unremarkable, rented a room in a part of town where nobody asked questions, and showed up the next morning at Blackthorn Holdings with a resume that listed nothing remarkable maintenance experience, basic electrical reliable references. The hiring manager barely looked up from her desk. They needed someone for the night rotation. He started that evening. Blackthorn Holdings occupied a glass tower in the center of the city's financial district, and from the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a legacy company, old and confident, the kind of business that had survived long enough to believe it always would. The lobby was marble and dark wood. The upper floors housed the executive suites. The lower floors held the machine rooms, the service corridors, the parts of the building that kept everything running and that no one in a tailored suit ever bothered to see. That was where Graham spent most of his time. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray beginning to show at his temples, and hands that had done more physical work than most people assumed. He was not a man who talked much. He showed up. He did what needed doing. He kept his head down. The other janitors on his shift learned quickly that he was not unfriendly, but also not looking for conversation. He fixed things without being asked: a loose ceiling panel in the third-floor corridor, a fluorescent light that had been flickering for weeks, a drainage issue in the east stairwell that facilities had apparently logged 3 times without resolution. Nobody said thank you. That was fine with him. What the night rotation staff did not know, what nobody in that building knew, was that Graham Cole had held a quiet minority stake in Blackthorn Holdings for nearly 9 years. He had come in through a private equity arrangement that Eleanor Blackthorn had structured during a period of financial difficulty, back when the company needed capital more than it needed questions. He had been a silent partner in the truest sense. No board seat, no operational role, no contact beyond quarterly statements. But over the past 18 months, the statements had started to look wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Subtly wrong, the kind of wrong that took someone who understood how numbers moved to notice it at all. Graham noticed, and before he exercised his contractual right to expand his stake into a controlling position, he wanted to understand what he was actually buying, so he became a janitor. It was not complicated. People in positions of power rarely thought about who was cleaning their offices at 11 o'clock at night, and that invisibility was, for his purposes, exactly what he needed. Within the first 2 weeks, he had already found more than he expected. Not dramatic evidence, not yet, but the kind of small inconsistencies that pointed toward something larger underneath. A vendor contract he spotted in an open conference room, left behind after a late meeting with terms that did not match the line items in the quarterly report he had memorized before arriving. A conversation he overheard between 2 men in the parking structure on his way to the loading dock. Names mentioned that did not appear on any org chart numbers, discussed in a tone that was too casual for the amounts involved. He did not write anything down at the building. He kept it in his head and recorded it later, alone in his room, in a system only he understood. He was careful. He had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a person could do in a situation like this was move too fast. Evelyn Blackthorn was the last person he expected to notice him. He had seen her on his second night stepping off the elevator at nearly midnight, with a stack of folders under one arm and her heels in the other hand. She was walking in socked feet across the marble lobby, which he thought was either very practical or very tired, and he had been mopping the section between the elevator bank and the front entrance. She had looked at him. Actually, looked at him, not through him, and said, "Sorry, I'll go around." Then she had walked the long way around the wet section without being asked and disappeared into the east corridor. Most executives walked through the wet floor. Some of them did it looking directly at the wet floor sign. Evelyn had gone around. He did not think much of it at the time, but he did not forget it either. Their second conversation happened about a week later. He had been in the process of replacing a ceiling tile outside the executive conference room on the 14th floor when she came out of the room, looking like someone who had just sat through a meeting designed to make her feel small. She stopped when she saw him on the ladder, as though she had expected the corridor to be empty, and was startled to find another person in it. "Does maintenance usually happen this late?" she asked. Her voice was even the kind of tone that came from years of practice keeping emotion out of professional settings. Graham looked down at her from the ladder. "Tile's been sagging for about 3 weeks, he said. "I put in a request the first week I was here. Nobody got to it." He turned back to what he was doing. "It's easier to get things done up here when the floor's empty." Evelyn looked at the tile, then back at him. "Fair enough," she said, and kept walking. That was all. But the next night, when he was in the same corridor, running a repair on one of the wall-mounted fixtures, she came through again. And this time, she slowed down instead of speeding up. The conversations that followed did not happen in any dramatic or deliberate way. They happened the way things happen when two people are consistently in the same place at the same time, and neither of them has much reason to pretend. She worked late almost every night, not because she was disorganized, he realized quickly, but because she was carrying workload that should have been distributed across a larger team and was instead sitting entirely on her. She was competent in a way that had been taken advantage of, which was a particular kind of exhaustion he recognized. He did not offer opinions about her work. She did not ask for them. What they talked about in the early weeks was almost nothing of consequence. The building, the city, the particular mood of Savannah at certain hours of the night. But there was something in those conversations that both of them seemed to need, without quite admitting it. She spoke to him like a person, not like a janitor, not like staff, like someone standing in a hallway who happened to be worth talking to. And he, in turn, did not perform anything. He did not pretend to be less than he was, or more than she needed him to be. He was just present, which was perhaps the one thing in short supply in her life. One evening she mentioned offhand that she had almost approved a vendor agreement that afternoon, but something in the terms had struck her wrong and she had pulled it for review. Graham asked, without looking up from the electrical panel he was working on, what specifically had struck her wrong. She told him. He listened, and then he said carefully that the amortization clause she was describing was unusual for that type of contract, that it created an exit structure that benefited the vendor disproportionately over a 5-year window, particularly if the company's revenue dropped below a certain threshold. Evelyn looked at him for a moment in a way that was different from all the previous moments. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the panel. "I read a lot," he said. She did not push it. But the next day she pulled the contract, had it reviewed by outside counsel, and killed it. The outside counsel confirmed exactly what Graham had described. The deal, had it gone through, would have cost the company somewhere in the range of $4 million over its term under adverse conditions. Conditions that, given what Graham already suspected about the company's internal situation, were not unlikely. He heard about the canceled contract indirectly through the kind of ambient information that circulates in a building when people don't think the person mopping the floor is listening. He said nothing, but he understood that Evelyn Blackthorne wasn't the problem in this company. She was the one person in it who was actually trying to do things right. That created a problem for him that he had not anticipated. The outline of his plan had always been clean: come and document what was happening, exercise his shareholder rights, restructure the company exit. None of that plan had included developing any particular feeling about anyone inside the building. He had been alone for a long time, long enough that he had learned to organize his life around the absence of complication. He was disciplined about it. He did not let himself want things that required him to be honest about who he was before he was ready. But there were evenings when he and Evelyn stood in the corridor outside the 14th floor conference room, and the city was quiet below the windows, and she talked about what she had originally wanted to do with the company before she had gotten ground down by the machinery of managing it, and something in him that had been very still for a very long time started to move again. He did not act on it. He did not allow himself to name it most of the time. But it was there, and it was growing. And it made the thing he was hiding feel heavier every time he walked into that building. Eleanor Blackthorne noticed her daughter's changed mood before she could identify its source. Eleanor was not a woman who missed things. She had built and maintained one of the most powerful private hospitality empires in the southeastern United States through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost clinical attention to detail. She was 71 years old and moved through rooms the way powerful people do, as though the room had been arranged for her benefit. She did not dislike Evelyn. She simply did not understand a version of her daughter that existed outside the architecture of the company, and so she had spent decades trying to ensure no such version emerged. When Evelyn began showing up to morning meetings with something that looked like lightness, not happiness exactly, but relief, the kind that comes from having a place where you can put something down. For a while, Eleanor noticed within days. She had her assistant pull the building's overnight access logs. She reviewed the security rotation. She found the name Graham Cole listed on maintenance schedules going back 5 weeks, cross-referenced it against HR records, and found exactly what she expected to find a janitor. A 42-year-old man on a modest hourly rate, no college degree, listed no notable employment history, a rental address in the eastern part of the city. She put the file down. She did not investigate further because she did not feel further investigation was necessary. What she felt instead was a cold and settled certainty that this would need to be handled. Graham, meanwhile, had crossed a line he had not planned to cross. It happened on a night when he had been at the building later than usual, finishing up a detailed review of the HVAC maintenance logs, which were, he had come to understand, a secondary record of vendor payment schedules that somebody very clever had embedded in routine maintenance documentation. He had been in the building's utility room on the basement level, sitting on a metal chair with his notebook, when Evelyn found him. She had come down looking for a facilities supervisor, and found Graham instead sitting under a fluorescent light with a photograph in his hand. An old photograph, the kind that has been handled so many times, the edges have gone soft. She had not meant to stay. She had taken one look at the expression on his face and understood instinctively that she had walked into something private. But he did not put the photograph away quickly the way people do when they've been caught in something they're ashamed of. He looked up at her, and then he looked back at the photograph, and then he set it face down on his knee. "My wife," he said simply. "She died. A long time ago, it feels like. Not that long, actually." Evelyn sat down on a metal chair across from him without asking. She did not say she was sorry, which he appreciated. She just sat there in the quiet of the basement utility room, and eventually she said, "How long have you been doing this being okay in front of everyone?" He thought about that for longer than the question probably required. "Long enough that I forgot I was doing it," he said. "Somewhere along the way, it just became the only way I knew how to be." She looked at her hands. "I know what that feels like," she said. And then, for the first time in as long as she could remember, she told someone the truth about what her life inside the company had actually been. Not the version she gave the board. Not the version she gave to press. The real version, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the way she had spent years making herself smaller and sharper at the same time, trying to be both useful and unthreatening to a mother who saw the company as an extension of herself and anyone who challenged it as a personal betrayal. Graham listened without trying to fix anything. When she finished, he said, That's a lot to carry by yourself." She looked at him in the flat, fluorescent light of a basement utility room in her work clothes, with no performance left in her, and said, "Yeah, it is." That was the night everything became complicated. Not because anything happened, nothing happened, but because Graham walked home that night knowing that the thing he had been refusing to name had become undeniable. He cared about her. Not in the way that complicated his plan, but in the way that complicated everything else. The hiding the distance he had built the version of himself he was presenting every time he walked into that building. He had a decision in front of him, and he did not like either of its options. If he told her the truth, he risked everything. Not the investigation, not the shareholder agreement, but the thing she had just given him for the first time in years. The feeling of being in a room with someone who knew nothing about his money or his history or his position, and chose to sit across from him anyway. If he kept hiding it, he was building something on ground that would eventually give way. He chose to wait. He told himself it was because the timing was wrong, because the investigation wasn't finished, because revealing his identity before he had the full picture would compromise everything. All of that was true. But the deeper truth was simpler and harder to admit. He was afraid of what her face would look like when she found out. And he had not been afraid of very much in a very long time. Eleanor did not confront Evelyn directly. That was not her style. What she did instead was begin a quiet campaign, the kind that left no fingerprints, the kind she had been running variations of for decades, against competitors, against board members, against anyone who had made the mistake of getting too close to something she considered hers. It started with comments, small ones calibrated to land without appearing to be aimed. At a family dinner, Eleanor mentioned that she had reviewed the overnight security logs, purely routine, she said, and noticed that Evelyn had been staying later than usual. She said it with the tone of a concerned mother, which was the most dangerous tone she had. She mentioned that the maintenance staff had apparently been doing a great deal of repair work on the upper floors. She said the building operations manager had told her the new janitor was thorough. She let the word janitor sit in the air for a moment before moving on to something else. Evelyn said nothing. She had grown up in this house with this woman, and she knew exactly what was happening. She picked up her fork and redirected the conversation toward a quarterly projection she needed Eleanor's sign-off on, and Eleanor let it go because she was patient, and because she had already set what she needed to set into motion. Graham found the second layer of the problem in the third week of November, and it was worse than the first. The vendor contract he had flagged for Evelyn had been one piece of a larger architecture. What he was now looking at, pieced together from maintenance logs, an invoice trail he had traced through 3 subsidiary entities, and a set of internal memos left in a recycling bin outside the CFO's office, suggested that Blackthorn Holdings had been quietly funneling operating revenue into a set of holding structures that were controlled not by the company, but by 2 individuals whose names he recognized from the conversation he had overheard in the parking structure weeks earlier. One of them was Eleanor's brother. The other was a man who sat on the company's audit committee. It was not a small thing. It was systematic patient, and it had been running for at minimum 4 years. Someone had built it carefully enough that it would survive a standard external audit, but not a forensic one. Graham was not conducting a forensic audit. He was a janitor technically, but he had enough of a picture now to know that when the truth of this company's internal finances came into the open, it was going to be significant. He also knew that Eleanor almost certainly knew. The structure was too embedded in the company's operations for the chairwoman to be unaware of it, which meant that everything Eleanor Blackthorn presented to the world, the legacy, the reputation, the carefully maintained image of a family institution, was at its core a performance sustained by money that did not belong to her. He sat with that for a long time before he wrote anything down. Evelyn, for her part, had started looking at things she had previously not allowed herself to look at too directly. It was not that she had been naive. She was not a naive person, but there is a particular blindness that comes from being inside a system you depend on, managed by a person you are supposed to trust. She had noticed irregularities before. She had asked questions and received answers that were technically plausible and quietly unsatisfying. She had learned over many years to file those feelings away and keep working, because the alternative was a confrontation that she was not sure she had the standing to win. What was changing now was not her intelligence. It was her willingness to act on what she already understood. She went back to the vendor contract she had killed and pulled the name of the entity that had originated it. She cross-referenced it against the company's known vendor register. It was not on the register. She checked the authorization trail and found that the contract had been submitted internally through a channel that bypassed her office entirely. It had gone straight to the CFO's desk and had been routed to her only at the final approval stage. That was not standard procedure. She documented it quietly and said nothing to anyone. One evening, she was walking back to her office from the east stairwell when she found Graham on the 14th floor, closing up the ceiling panel he had worked on weeks earlier. A different tile this time, one that had developed a similar issue. She stopped and leaned against the corridor wall and watched him work for a moment before she spoke. "You ever notice something that doesn't add up?" she said. Not quite a question. And then, the longer you look at it, the more things stop adding up around it. Graham came down from the ladder slowly. He looked at her with the kind of attention that she had noticed from the beginning, not the attention that was looking for something from her, but the kind that was simply present. "That's usually how it goes," he said. "The first thing you find is rarely the only thing." She studied him. He had said it without any particular emphasis, as though it were obvious, as though he had seen that pattern play out before. "You really do read a lot," she said. He picked up the ladder. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, and walked toward the service corridor. She stayed in the hall for another moment, looking at the space where he had been, and then went back to her office and stayed until well past midnight. Eleanor's investigation into Graham had by this point produced nothing useful. The background check she had run through a private firm came back clean, which was to say it came back empty in a way that satisfied her, because empty meant small, and small meant manageable. She had his rental address, his work history, his social security record, going back through a series of modest jobs in other states. There was nothing there that alarmed her. There was also nothing there that suggested anything other than what he appeared to be. This, ironically, was because Graham's actual financial life was held under a separate legal structure, a holding entity registered in Delaware that bore no connection to his personal identity in any searchable public record. He had set it up that way deliberately years ago for reasons unrelated to this particular situation. It had simply never occurred to him that it would one day serve as a kind of shield. Eleanor concluded that the janitor was a janitor. She concluded that Evelyn was going through some phase of restlessness that probably had more to do with the pressure she was under than with any genuine feeling for a maintenance worker. She decided to handle it the way she handled most things that threatened to become inconvenient, by removing the context that was allowing it to grow. She announced the gala in the second week of December. The official purpose of the event was to mark the company's 55th anniversary. The real purpose, which everyone who had worked for Eleanor for more than a year understood immediately, was to announce Evelyn's engagement to the son of a family whose hospitality holdings in the mid-Atlantic region were a strategic asset Eleanor had wanted to consolidate for almost a decade. The young man's name was Carter Voss. He was 38, well-presented, and entirely willing to participate in whatever arrangement his own family's attorneys had worked out with Eleanor's. Whether Evelyn was also willing was a question that Eleanor had characteristically not asked. When the invitations went out, one of them went to Graham Cole. It was included in a batch sent to all building staff as a gesture of employee appreciation. Eleanor's assistant had told him this directly, in the tone of someone delivering good news. Graham accepted because declining would have required an explanation, and he was not yet ready to explain anything. The gala was on a Friday. Graham's shift ended at 10 o'clock that night. The event had started at 8. He could not leave early without raising questions, and so when his shift ended, he walked from the service entrance to the main entrance, still wearing his uniform, the gray work pants, the dark jacket with the building operations logo on the chest, and stepped into a ballroom that held more than 300 people in formal dress. He was 2 hours late. The room was in full motion. He was not embarrassed by what he was wearing. He was not a man who attached his sense of self to the surface of things, and he had walked into more difficult rooms than this one. But he was aware of the way the room shifted when he entered the small recalibrations, the eyes that moved across him and quickly away, the kind of social friction that comes from the visible presence of someone who does not fit the established order of a room. He took a glass of water from a passing tray and stood near the back wall and watched. He found Evelyn within 30 seconds. She was near the front of the room, standing beside her mother in a dark green dress, with an expression on her face that he recognized the one she wore when she was performing competence while managing something she had not consented to. She had not seen him yet. Eleanor had seen him immediately. He knew this because she was the kind of woman who cataloged every room she was in, and he was the most conspicuous person in that room. She did not look at him for long. She looked just long enough to confirm that he was there, and then she looked away, and something in the set of her jaw changed. About 40 minutes after Graham arrived, Eleanor tapped her champagne glass, and the room came to order. She spoke about the company's history, 55 years, 2 generations, a record of resilience and vision that she narrated with the fluency of someone who had delivered some version of this speech many times. She thanked her executives, her partners, her guests. She mentioned Carter Voss by name and let the implication of his presence be understood by everyone in the room who had been invited to understand it. And then she turned her gaze across the ballroom, and it settled on Graham Cole, standing at the back wall in his work uniform, and she said, clearly, and without any particular heat, as though she were stating a fact about the weather, "A single dad could never provide for my daughter." The room did not erupt. It did not need to. A sound moved through it, not quite laughter, not quite approval, the sound of 300 people registering that something had just been said and declining to object to it. It was the sound of a room deciding collectively and instantly not to be uncomfortable on behalf of the wrong person. Evelyn's face went very still. She had been looking at her mother when it happened, and she did not look away. And whatever she was feeling in that moment did not make it onto her face, which told Graham more about how much practice she had at that particular suppression than anything she had ever said directly. Graham stood at the back of the room. He did not move. He did not respond. He felt the weight of 300 people's awareness land on him, and he let it sit there, and he did not give it anything to work with. The fist that closed at his side was the only thing in his body that moved. He held it there for a count of 3, and then released it. He put his glass of water on the nearest surface and walked out of the ballroom through the main entrance, and the door swung shut behind him without a sound. He walked home. It was 51 degrees outside, and he did not have a jacket beyond the work uniform, but he did not want to wait for a car. He needed the air and the distance and the particular clarity that came from moving his body through the cold. He thought about Eleanor's face when she said it. He thought about Evelyn's face a half-second later. He thought about the basement utility room and the photograph and the fluorescent light and the 45 minutes during which something real had been allowed to exist between 2 people who had not been performing anything. He had built the plan around the assumption that the personal and the professional could be kept separate until the time was right. He understood now that this assumption had been wrong for some time. He had waited too long, and the waiting had cost him the only thing he had not known he was protecting. By the time he reached his rental, the decision was already made. He would finish what he had come to do. But when it was over, when the truth was in the open and the positions were clear, he would tell Evelyn everything. Not to defend himself, just to tell her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. Graham did not return to the building the following Monday. He called in through the facilities line and said he had a personal matter to attend to, which was true. He spent 3 days in his rental room with every document he had assembled over the past 2 months spread across the table in front of him. Photographs taken on his phone, handwritten notes, the traced invoice trail that connected 3 subsidiary entities back to 2 names he had confirmed were Eleanor's brother and the audit committee member. He organized it into a format that an attorney could work with. He sent a copy to a secure server. He called his lawyer in Atlanta and told him to be ready to move within a week. Then he went back to work. He showed up Thursday morning, same time as always, same uniform, same quiet. The other staff on his rotation did not ask where he had been. He fixed a drainage issue in the west stairwell and replaced a burnt-out emergency light on the 6th floor and said nothing to anyone that was not directly related to the work in front of him. He did not see Evelyn that week. He did not look for her. Evelyn had spent those same days doing something she had not done in years, going looking for answers on her own terms, without asking permission, and without managing anyone's comfort in the process. She started with the vendor entity she had identified before the gala, the one that had bypassed her office entirely. She pulled every contract in the company's system that had been routed through the same internal channel. There were 11 of them, over 4 years, ranging in value from $200,000 to $1.3 million. She cross-referenced the authorizing signatures. 8 of the 11 had been approved by the CFO. 3 of them had Eleanor's signature directly. She printed everything, locked it in her personal office safe, and called a corporate attorney she had retained privately. Not through the company 3 years earlier, for a reason she had told herself at the time was just prudence. The attorney reviewed what she sent him over 48 hours and called her back on a Wednesday morning. His assessment was careful and deliberate, the way attorneys are when the situation is serious and they want to be precise. What Evelyn was looking at, he said, had the structure of a systematic diversion of company operating funds. It was not conclusive on its own, but it was enough to warrant a formal forensic audit. And it was enough that any competent board member who saw it would have a legal obligation to act. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table after the call and looked out the window at the gray December morning for a long time. She was not surprised. That was the worst part, the complete absence of surprise. She had known somewhere beneath the part of herself that needed the company to be what it claimed to be for longer than she wanted to admit. What she felt now was not shock. It was the particular grief of a thing finally named. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Eleanor had called it to finalize the terms of a new strategic partnership, the consolidation with the Voss family holdings that the gala had been designed to announce. The meeting had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. Eleanor had structured the agenda to move quickly with the partnership agreement as the final item, presented as a formality after a series of operational updates that were designed to occupy the board's attention and goodwill for the first 2 hours. Graham knew the meeting was happening because the building's facilities calendar listed it as a full-day executive floor booking. He also knew through his attorney that the legal structure Eleanor was trying to finalize would, if executed, create a shareholder dilution mechanism that would effectively neutralize his existing stake. It had been built into the Voss partnership agreement on page 47 in language that required a specific kind of reading to understand. His attorney had flagged it 48 hours earlier. It was not an accident. This was the move Eleanor had been building toward. Not the gala, not the humiliation, those had been personal. This was professional. This was the mechanism by which she intended to make sure that whatever quiet stake some unknown investor held in her company would cease to matter before anyone had the chance to exercise it. Graham put on a suit for the first time in 2 months. It was charcoal gray, well cut, the kind of clothing that does not announce itself but cannot be misread. He had kept it in a garment bag at the back of the rental room's closet since the day he arrived. He had not looked at it much. He put it on that Tuesday morning, drove to the building, and entered through the main entrance. The woman at the front reception desk looked up at him with the expression of someone who did not immediately recognize a face they had seen before in an entirely different context. Then something shifted in her eyes. Not recognition exactly, but the particular social recalibration that happens when a person's appearance does not match the file the brain has already built. She asked if she could help him. He told her he was here for the board meeting. He gave his name. She checked the list, and his name was not on it because he had not been invited, because no one in that building knew that his name should be. He asked her to call upstairs and tell the board that Graham Cole, representing a 9% controlling stake in Blackthorn Holdings, was in the lobby and would like to be admitted to the meeting before the partnership vote was taken. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without heat, without any visible investment in whether she believed him. She made the call. The boardroom on the 16th floor went very still when he walked in. There were 9 people at the table, 6 board members, the CFO, Eleanor's chief of staff, and Eleanor herself, seated at the head. Evelyn was not in the room. She had not been included in this particular meeting, which was itself a fact that said something. Eleanor looked at him, the way someone looks at a thing that has appeared in the wrong place, not with fear, not yet, but with the focused attention of a person rapidly recalculating. She did not say anything immediately. She let the room's confusion do its work for a moment. Graham set a portfolio on the table. He did not sit down right away. He addressed the room the way he addressed most situations, directly without preamble. "My name is Graham Cole," he said. "I've held a minority stake in this company for 9 years through a Delaware holding entity called Meridian Capital Partners. That stake is currently at 9%, which under the terms of the original shareholder agreement gives me the right to expand to a controlling position upon 30 days written notice, triggered by any material change in the company's ownership or partnership structure." He looked at the board members on either side of the table. "The partnership agreement you're about to vote on constitutes that trigger. I submitted my notice to the company's registered legal address at 8:45 this morning." The CFO started to say something. One of the board members put a hand up in his direction without looking at him, the gesture of someone who needed to hear the rest before they formed an opinion. Eleanor's expression had not changed in any way that a casual observer would have identified as change. But Graham had spent 2 months in her building, and he had learned to read the subtle architecture of her face. What he saw there now was not anger. It was the cold, contained look of someone absorbing a loss and already deciding how to respond to it. "You were the janitor," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Graham said. She looked at him for a long moment. "That was a considerable effort," she said, "for a man who could have simply sent a letter." "I could have," he said. "But a letter wouldn't have told me what I needed to know about the state of the company I was preparing to take a position in. The letter would have told me the numbers. Being here told me the rest." He opened the portfolio and set a document in front of each board member. It was a summary, precise, organized 40 pages of everything he had assembled over the past 2 months. The vendor trail, the subsidiary structures, the names, the amounts, the authorization signatures. He had not embellished it, had not editorialized. It was a document built entirely from the company's own records, organized in a sequence that made the pattern impossible to miss. The room read in silence. Evelyn heard about it from her assistant, who heard it from someone on the 16th floor who had been passing the boardroom when the door was opened briefly. By the time Evelyn reached the executive floor, the meeting had been suspended. 3 board members were standing in the corridor with their phones out. The CFO was nowhere to be seen. The door to the boardroom was closed. She stood in the corridor for a moment, and then she opened the door. Graham was standing at the far end of the table. Eleanor was still seated at the head. The remaining board members were present. No one was talking. The portfolio documents were spread across the table. Evelyn looked at the room, and then she looked at Graham. Really looked at him, in a suit with the portfolio in front of him, and the particular stillness of a man who had just done something he had been preparing to do for a long time. And she understood, in a way that did not require anyone to explain it, the full shape of what she had been standing in the middle of without knowing it. She did not say anything. She sat down in the nearest empty chair and looked at the document in front of her, and she read it. The board voted to suspend Eleanor's executive authority pending an independent forensic audit. It was not a close vote. The partnership agreement with the Voss family was tabled indefinitely. Eleanor's legal counsel was notified. The process that followed was slow and procedural, and largely without drama, which is how these things go when the documentation is clean. Graham made one formal proposal at the close of the meeting. He did not want the operational role that his controlling stake technically entitled him to assume. What he proposed instead was that Evelyn Blackthorne be appointed interim chief executive with full authority to cooperate with the audit and to restructure the company's internal governance in whatever way she judged necessary. He presented this to the board not as a concession, but as the conclusion his investigation had led him to, that Evelyn was the only person in the company who had consistently tried to do the right thing, and that the company's best chance at becoming what it had always claimed to be was to put someone in charge who actually meant it. The board approved it. Eleanor said nothing. Evelyn found Graham in the corridor outside the boardroom an hour later. The floor had largely emptied by then. She had her jacket over her arm and the portfolio document in her hand, and she looked like someone who had been handed something very heavy and was still deciding how to hold it. 9 years, she said. She was not angry, or rather, she was angry in the specific way that comes when the anger and the understanding arrive at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. You've held a stake in this company for 9 years. Yes, Graham said. And you came in as a janitor. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with, he said. The financial records weren't telling the full story. They rarely do. She looked at him steadily. And us, she asked. The conversations, the all of it. Was that part of understanding what you were dealing with? He did not look away. No, he said. That was the part I didn't plan for. She looked down at the document in her hand, and then back at him. He waited. He had learned over the past 2 months that Evelyn Blackthorne needed space to arrive at her own conclusions, and that the worst thing he could do in this moment was try to fill the silence with justification. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, she said finally. Because it's not entirely fine, and you know that. I know that, he said. But I also know. She stopped and started again, choosing the words carefully. I know that what happened in that basement was real. I know you weren't performing anything. And I know the difference because I've been performing things for people my entire life, and I know what it looks like. She looked at him. You weren't doing that. No, he said. I wasn't. She nodded slowly the way someone nods when they are filing something in the right place inside themselves. She was not ready to be past it. That was honest, and he respected it. What mattered was that she was not walking away. The forensic audit took 4 months. Eleanor's brother and the audit committee member were referred to federal prosecutors. Eleanor herself was not charged. The investigation concluded that her direct involvement in the diversion structure fell short of the criminal threshold, though her civil liability was considerable. She resigned from the board in February quietly through her attorney without a statement. In the weeks that followed her resignation, something shifted in Eleanor that no board vote or legal filing had produced. She had spent 55 years building a company around the belief that power was the only language that mattered, that a person's worth was legible only through their position, their assets, the weight of their name in a room. She had applied that belief to everyone around her, including her own daughter, including a man she had humiliated in front of 300 people without knowing who he was. What she understood now, sitting alone in the house that the company had paid for, and that felt considerably emptier than it once had, was that she had been wrong, not strategically, not legally, but in the way that costs the most and cannot be recovered by any filing or restructuring. She did not say this to anyone, but she stopped saying the other things too, and sometimes that is the only form of understanding available to a person at a certain stage of their life. Blackthorne Holdings' largest property, a grand hotel on the edge of the historic district. One of the original assets the company had been built around, underwent a full renovation under Evelyn's direction and reopened in late spring. It was the first project she had led with complete authority, without anyone above her adjusting her decisions or redirecting her priorities, and it showed. The reopening was well attended and well reviewed. The building felt for the first time in a long time like something that had been taken care of. Graham was there that evening, not in any official capacity. He had not wanted an official capacity. He walked the property during the reopening reception, and at one point, he stopped in the east corridor near the service elevator, the part of the building that guests rarely saw, but that held the mechanical infrastructure. Everything else depended on, and found, that a light fixture near the corridor ceiling was mounted slightly off level. He found a maintenance closet, borrowed a screwdriver, and leveled it. When he came back out into the corridor, Evelyn was standing there watching him. She had a glass of champagne and her jacket on, and the expression she wore when something had caught her off guard in a way she found more amusing than annoying. "You just fixed a light fixture at your own reopening event," she said. "It was crooked," he said. She looked at the fixture, then at him. "The whole hotel's been renovated, and you're fixing a crooked light fixture in a corridor no one's going to see. Someone will see it eventually," he said. "The people who keep the building running will see it every day." She looked at him in the quiet of the service corridor, with the sound of the reception carrying softly from the other end of the building, and something in her expression settled not into happiness exactly, but into something steadier than that. The kind of feeling that doesn't need a name, because it has already found its place. "Come back to the reception," she said. He put the screwdriver back in the maintenance closet, and they walked back down the corridor together, toward the light and the sound of the gathered crowd through the same hallway, where months earlier, a man in a janitor's uniform had fixed a ceiling tile late at night, while a woman in socked feet had gone out of her way to walk around a wet floor. Neither of them said anything about that. They did not need to. Some things do not need to be said to be understood, and some distance is close so gradually that by the time you notice you are already on the other side.